Okay. For the next section of this ongoing lecture series, we're going to go straight to the core of the breach of modernity, which to me is the period of just a few decades between the death of Nietzsche's pre-modern Germany and the rise of Hitler's modern Germany, which is the Weimar Republic, and the explosion of creative activity which emerges from the Weimar Republic. And the question is, why does this happen? And I think there's a multitude of economic and maybe more political answers, which I would argue are ultimately superficial in the face of the death of the symbolic order, which is the ontological abgrund, which opens up and bottoms out with the rise of industrial technology, which ultimately, as we observe historically, explodes onto the world scene with Germany's loss in World War I and the bankrupting of the country, which leads to extreme poverty, high inflation, and societal civilization level breakdown as the values or the center of values can no longer hold. The worldview itself now appears to be utterly grafted onto a historical and political situation which does not and cannot conform to the agrarian sun-moon somatic time, which has become factory time. The light bulb, electricity, and this new form of labor production, this new mode of machine. So we have a combination here, I think, the two main philosophers, which I would use of modernity, even more so than Marx, I think, in a structural way, Heidegger and Hegel, because both of them are concerned with the ontos, or the shining forth of being. And what my work has done is structurally move with both Hegel and Heidegger, which is to say being and being in time, Hegel's philosophy of history, that being becomes legible as in a shining forth disclosed through the poet, or poetic being, poetic dwelling, which is, as we've described in the Kafka essay, as well as the Artaud essay. And I'm framing these improvisational lectures as essays because they are navigations through this water or this wilderness. This shining forth of being is being made legible through the neurosomatic sensitivity of the poetic dwelling of man. Of course, the poet is the one who describes and inscribes this dwelling poetically via thinking languaging, as in a deep time neurogenetic possibility of iteration, which is to say the passage of the genome, which is thermonuclear energy, through deep historical time, as in the species level and the earth level. Again, the genome is something that is shared earth-wide, so to speak. So between the time of Hegel and Shelley, as we've discussed, which would be the 1810s, 1820s, which is 100 years prior to the birth of the Weimar Republic, and the birth of the Weimar Republic, which we can mark with Kafka or Trakl, which is to say World War I era Germany. And we've gone over Otto Diess, George Gross, Max Beckmann. There's a multitude of different figures, Rosa Luxemburg, all of whom emerge in this very fertile period of German creativity and imagining, similar to what is occurring in Russia with Mayakovsky, Akhmatova, etc. This is an extremely fertile period for creativity. In the death of the European symbolic order, which is a pre-modern symbolic order, of an atavistic relationship to being in terms of sun-moon cycles, local agrarian societies, which are time and space bound by the lack of the airplane or these advanced technologies such as the car that emerge at the thermodynamic transformation of the latent fossil fuel energy of the 20th century. In this gap of 100 years, we have Darwin, we have the emergence of these paradigm-shifting and phase-changing thermodynamic persistence strategies. We have Maxwell and Boltzmann. We have just as much as the industrial technological revolution, we have the matching scientific revolution into Max Planck of the 20th century, into Fermi as we move toward World War II. This is an unprecedented period of scientific revolution, which translates directly into technological profusion. Without these revolutions, we would not have factory. We would not have the atom bomb. Fermi being both a theorist and a practitioner, as evidenced in his work on the atom bomb and the fusion reactor. So this transformation, again, both at the technological and scientific level, is a widening gap between the ancestral information technology, which is genomic transmission and recombination at the species level, which is the production of disclosure, which, as we've discussed, is the Renaissance mind, or the poet who dwells close to being, and thus through neurosomatic sensitivity and this literal embodied closeness is articulating the relationship of being in proximity to character at source of truth. And I've described what this character is in a transscalar way as the operator identity, which I've formalized in my structural theories. That being itself does have character, and the character is structural, and it is a behavior. That the way of being in time across scales has a structural, infrastructural, foundational identity. That this is the natural informational technology which is taking place across time, which we see in such diverse figures as Heraclitus or Kafka. That this proximity to disclosure is a gap which is widening in modernity due to the lengthening of the symbolic chain, which is the transformation of energy into new forms of increasingly powerful technologies, which themselves are states of illusion, in that they're being generated from the genetic substrate of man and being converted into standing order social, political, economic structures, which Mayakovsky calls the byt, or the everyday. So the rise and fall of empires therein is the illusion of reason before the gleaming, which of course returns us to the poet and this proximity of dwelling and this relationship of being in relation to being, this closeness of dwelling, and the real process of disclosure. So this is the issue, that the gap widens in this transformation, which we could say really is a linguistic transformation of energy. When we think about the conversion of the fossil fuel into the factory or the car or the airplane, these are, or electricity. We see this move further as we move into the 21st century with artificial intelligence, the digital world. These are extensions of the symbolic chain of the conversion of energy into, we could say, money as a currency, or political strategy, ideology itself. Extensions of the symbolic chain which are further and further alienated from this primary state of the innocence of languaging, which is the poetic dwelling of being in time. And what we witness in the Weimar Republic, and this is just such an important period to do a diagnostic or a surgery into the illness of modernity, is that we witness this gap between the pre-modern agrarian mythos, which we could describe as a like an atavistic cosmos or a narrative cosmos, which was possible due to the low energy state of the collective at this period of time, which is to say very local, based in consumption of the animal and the plant at a local scale, minimal trade and minimal energetic movement occurring across nonetheless national but transnational borders or transcontinental borders, and that the explosion of the phase change of technological modernity, which is a fossil fuel-based phase change, an electricity-based phase change, which is founded in the scientific principles of this impending rupture of the 19th century into the 20th, and extended to this profound culminatory act of the atom bomb, the outcome of which we are still dealing with today as the primary energetic state of gridlock at the global modernity scale of digital technology. That this moment of phase change is the death or the absence or the gape of the symbolic order, which has died, and the necessity of a new one arising, which ultimately becomes Hitler's Germany, just as we have a very similar phase change occurring, and this is why Russian literature is so important, in Russia, from the Tsarist Russia to the Leninist, Trotskyist, into Stalinist Russia. And what I'm suggesting is that these phase changes with Hegel are mapping not onto a illogical history. They're mapping onto a thermodynamic and thermonuclear history of possibilities, which is to say latent possibilities made available by the revolutions of science, which then become the revolutions of technology, which is to say science is now interspersed and placed into the everyday. We can see this even from Sadi Carnot and the foundation of thermodynamics and the conversion of his theories on engines, I believe it was steam engines, into cars and airplanes. And what these engines do is they speed up the relationship to space and time, which is a neural somatic state, and make available increasingly time-space territories. They condense the normal period of walking or horseback, etc. And this phase change again is accomplished into the digital technological terrain, which is to say making available images or resources, materials, or money, again, an abstracted form of currency, which is the creation of physical possibility, digital bank accounts, cryptocurrency, etc. So we're looking at these degrees of extension of the human being and the human body, which I have termed prosthetics. And this is critical because this is a very primary situation which we observe in the new objectivity painting of Weimar Republic, Diess and Gross. We're witnessing a transformation of the human being, and this is critically observed in the prosthetic instruments or implements of the soldier. As he returns from war and has skin or legs or arms grafted onto him in this grotesque transformation, which is documented by New Objectivity. But this realization or this visualization itself is a transformation of the possibilities of the human being, which is written into the breakpoint of the Weimar Republic in its brief existence. And this in turn goes all the way down to the rights of women, the social and political possibilities of living in space and time in the Weimar Republic. The brothels were a big aspect of this. This is a breakdown of the socio-political standing values, which were to say a sort of conservative, atavistic, local collective of, let's say, religious agreement as to behavior, which you could call a social contract or an ontological border or a boundary. I call this a membrane in my work on pseudo-closed boundaries in a thermodynamic sense. But the literal boundaries of what it is to be German or to exist in this area, formerly known as Germany, so to speak, and then in this period of the terrain being utterly renegotiated by the breakdown of the ontological code of pre-modern Germany, is now thrown into absolute chaos. The symbolic order has collapsed, and we see the emergence of Dada and Surrealism and New Objectivity. What I'm suggesting is that the very bounds of perception and the very bounds of what is possible in a human being are being renegotiated in real time due to this fundamental ontological collapse. And what emerges in this period of this extreme mass proliferation of art is precisely this problem. And this is not just a proliferation of art, it is the proliferation of the foundation of psychology. It is various different political theorists and philosophers who are suggesting what is possible next and what should occur next, because this phase change, again, the thermodynamic phase change of industrial technological modernity, has broken open this pressure valve of the history of what was possible and has exceeded the cultural limit, which has now thrown into question what is being itself. This returns me back to the journal excerpt from Pascal, which is God is the cultural limit. And this territory is being negotiated poetically, which is the exploration of the extent of which is being. And what Mayakovsky supposes in the Russian Revolution in this period is a lived, felt sense of being in collective. And this is a profound, again, to return us to the cosmological sensibility of the poet who is dwelling in relation to being in time, a lived, felt sense of energy, or the thermodynamic substrate, through which a sense of the being self, or the I, is unintelligible, or those boundaries are uncertain and being perennially negotiated even by such acts as eating or drinking. And this is what unites figures as historically diverse and multiple as Artaud and Rimbaud. This French tradition, I would say in particular, which is also, of course, a European tradition, of negotiating subjectivity. And it's a fascinating construct to explore, because this is essentially what the breaking open of the borders of the poet entails, that this dwelling in relation to proximity to being is described by Hölderlin as a danger, because what it describes is a revelation, or breaking into this substrate, which is the operator identity, or the character at the source of truth of being itself, that nature's being is not a bordered or bounded entity, but rather a series of pseudo-closed membranes which are constantly exchanging energy and as such are unintelligible. That the Western philosophical or civilizational idea of subjectivity, or the I, as a relevant or articulatable mode of being is at the foundation of the delusions and illusions of Western civilization itself, which builds this I literally upon the back of a patrilineage, inheritance, property, and division, as in the establishment of the individual self. And this is what is experienced exponentially as modernity progresses, and this is really the bounds and borders of everything that is being negotiated, from the nation state to the Weimar Republic to the possession and ownership of energy, land, property. This is the attempt to carve up the world. And maybe I will use that satirical political cartoon as the cover for this lecture, as an image. And this is a question which lies at the heart of the artistic and creative pursuit of the Weimar Republic. Because when these symbolic order grounds disappear, as in, let's say, the legislations of God which hold together the collective which is operating to survive in a natural wilderness of the sun and moon and these very limited local conditions, when these conditions expand rapidly to increasingly include global information, the ideological or imagined concepts of self and other, just as nation and collective, are thrown into a chaos, thrown into an informational and energetic chaos of the need to assimilate new information rapidly into the collective and subjective worldview, which is itself that which holds together the supposed terrain of the individual. And ultimately, this is an unchanging physical metabolic state of eating, excretion, sleeping, etc. This is the foundational somatic state of the living being, and everything beyond that is a political ontology. It's the grafting of an ideological subsystem into the neurosomatic condition of being human, which is navigating the pathway of the self in relation to the world. And this is a state that is founded in early childhood developmental psychology. The attempt to make intelligible and thus navigable the relation of the vulnerable animal body to the dangerous, wide open terrain of the world. This is a condition that's ceaseless, and it is itself the foundation of cosmology, both ancient and modern. The attempt to make intelligible, and this is, of course, the same derivational process with which we get quantum mechanics, just as we get the Aztec or the Olmec cosmogony and cosmology. That to make intelligible the world in terms of identifying that which itself is being is to consolidate time and history, progress into a narrative form which is digestible and does not break down or corrode. And this is the primary difference between the mode of the philosopher, you could say Leibniz or Spinoza, and the nation-state ideological narrative symbolic codes which perennially collapse, which is the ontological guidelines of civilizations. Because as the terrain expands, the concept of self and other is disrupted by these intermediate ontologies. These are provisional ontologies. They're not cosmological ontologies. And this is why today Spinoza is still being discussed, and Spinoza is still relevant, just as Hegel and just as Heidegger are relevant, because they are asking the eternal questions, the questions in relationship to being itself. What is the operator identity, or what is the character at the source of truth at a multi-scalar cosmological and at the smallest scalar scope of the individual? So this loss of reason, these are the ontological gaps, or the bottoming out of these foundational cosmologies, which then create the death of nations or death of empires, which we witness in this period of the Weimar Republic, just as we do with Russia at the same period of time, which is a civilizational phase change which cannot accommodate the pre-modern or atavistic ontology. And in this chaos, right, which is a literal lived historical condition of extreme poverty and inflation, which leads to mass civilizational breakdown and the consolidation of this wide open frame of the Weimar Republic, which becomes itself a sort of free, relatively unnegotiated space. It becomes consolidated into Hitler's promise to reunite Germany under the myth of the Volk, and to reignite a period of unfounded or maybe unprecedented prosperity for the German people through a series of ideological commands. This is, of course, the call sign of the orator or the dictator. The issue itself is that the ontological ground in this historical situation, as in all historical situations, is not being truly negotiated as a philosophical inquiry into being, but rather these are provisional structures, or the assurances of provisional structures, which of course themselves are never built, which is to hold up a literal energetic, which is to say economic relationship to life itself, making provisional this relationship as science and technology forge compressions of space and time and proliferate energy in ways which are not being assimilated or digested or metabolized into the civilizational structure of the relationship to being itself. And this is itself, which I've discussed, the break from the poet in modernity, that the poetic dwelling is no longer the foundation of civilizations, but rather it's this provisional architecture of power to consolidate these rapid industrial, technological, and scientific revolutions, while the ontology, which is to say the relationship to being of modern civilization, lags grotesquely behind the corpse that is dragging, which is the spiritual body of the human collective. So to return to the eruption of surrealism, Dadaism, and new objectivity, this extreme creative fertility which we experience at the turn of the 20th century in Europe, not just in Germany, but in Europe itself, is the intuition of this opening, this opening of the political terrain, which is manifest in the extreme economic and political conditions of being in time itself, as Europe is attempting to consolidate and reconsolidate itself in light of the industrial technology which has emerged and utterly changed the circumstances of relation to being in time. It has utterly changed the everyday. The pre-modern ontology of Europe itself was not prepared for and could not assimilate this phase change or this phase shift. When this gap opens, it is rushed to be filled, and this is the case of the chaos that emerges after the collapse of Tsarist Russia, that there are these different power regimes or provisional architectures, such as Lenin or Trotsky, which are attempting to fill the space of the fall of the provisional architecture of empire, or the Tsarist state, which of course transforms into Stalin. These are not answers to the problem of relation to being, or dwelling in relation to being, which is fundamentally the poetic and cosmological problem of existential humanity itself. And this is the question that Mayakovsky is fundamentally oriented towards. And Mayakovsky understands quite clearly this is a cosmological, just as well as it is a political, economic, and historical problem, but it is only soluble at the cosmological level, because the cosmological level itself is the highest relation to being. It is the eternal law, or the structural being itself, downstream of which political economy, history, the human being all fall. So this is the problem solving of existential philosophy. It's the problem solving of the structural question of being that we see emerge in the relation of these great minds over periods of centuries. Again, from Spinoza to Hegel to Heidegger. The history of Western philosophy is the history of solving the meaningful question, or the only meaningful question, which is being in relation to being. And that the poets and the philosophers themselves are a sort of a guild or a collective toward this problem, which is an eternal problem, which is why it persists and moves through time accordingly and remains relevant regardless of time. And this principle, of course, is not being applied at the civilizational or collective level, because provisional architecture is the architecture of a problem that is only being attempted to solve when there is crisis enough to solve it. That the poets and the philosophers themselves are the unacknowledged legislators, as Shelley said, as opposed to the institutional legislators. And this is the primary conflict of modern civilization and empire itself, is that legislation is emerging not even in an Alexandrian sense in relation to Aristotle and this tutelage in the absolute living foundations of Greek philosophical history, but rather that these provisional architectures are being built by questionless bureaucracy or questionless aristocracy. And this is the eternal corruption of human being at the lived civilizational and historical level, with perhaps the rare exception. And that the failure to ask these questions is that these crisis points are reached because the provisional architectures of the civilizational ontos, which is nothing more than a house of sticks or a house of cards, inevitably collapses due to the marching scientific, innovating, informational, technological intuition and backbone of the human species, which is to say it is innovating the relationship to being by exploring the possibilities of nature, making disclosed the relationship of the human being to nature and the energetic substrates therein, from Copernicus to Newton to quantum mechanics. That this question is pursued perennially by the inquiring minds, both of science and of poetry, but that the civilizational, which is to say the infrastructure of the transformation of energy and the articulation of the collective body, is itself the gap or the loss, which is perennial in human history. And the Weimar Republic itself being the moment at which this gap is made most glaring in the modern sense. So we have the eruption of art, and what I have to suggest here, which is maybe the most profound aspect of this, is that art itself, unless we are talking about disclosure technology, which is to say Hölderlin or Trackle, which is it's a hermetic, very hermetic and closed practice of being in relation to being, that art itself is a historical and political response to lived, felt, economic conditions, or cultural conditions, social conditions, and that there's a category beneath art, which is to say disclosure technology, which is the work of the ontological poet or the ontological philosopher, which we could just group together as metaphysics, whether that's Spinoza or Hölderlin. And that this is the question of solving for the problem at the level of being, character at the source of truth, or the operator identity, and that this is a very, very, very small portion of human history, but is itself the only structure, it is the only foundation which can accommodate any phase change, which is to say death, rebirth of civilizations, collapse, destitution of civilizational or cultural narratives, loss of values, economic and political destitution and corruption, that to solve the problem for the level of being at the level of being, which is cosmological, is the only possibility of solving the problem. Otherwise, the problem reemerges again and again and again because it is being accommodated provisionally by administrators, which is to say bureaucratic administrators, whether that's an emperor or a king or a politician or a businessman. That these are provisional architectures to extract energetic information, to control energetic information, in so long and insofar as it is functional, which is not a true ontological solution. It's a provisional architecture destined for collapse. This is, again, the rise and fall of empires, the illusion of reason before the gleaming, and the real process of disclosure, which is beings in relation to being. And this relationship is perhaps most archetypally embodied by Shelley and Da Vinci, which is to say that the pursuit of poetic disclosure of the ontos is entirely connected to every discipline, including science, including political theory, including anatomy, including electricity. And that the statements that emerge from Shelley or Da Vinci or even Goethe are the only reliable ontological statements, because they are transscalar discoveries at the level of the identity of creation and existence itself, which incorporate everything from art, symbol, to electricity, to energy, to magnetism, and that these total ontological pursuits are the true and only guiding thread, the only legible architecture of human history in the face of the overturning, the perpetual overturning of the provisional attempts to control and manipulate energetic architecture throughout time and history. This is the history of all civilizations. And that what we have is these few thin, albeit powerful and magnitudinous threads of these total ontological pursuits, these passions, whether again that's Shelley or Da Vinci, the Renaissance mind, to unify the ontos. And these historical gapes, as with the Weimar Republic and the explosion and profusion of these art forms, are responses to the death of the ontos civilizationally, and that the civilizational death of the ontos is itself Heidegger's world's midnight. But this has nothing to say for who he turns to, which is Hölderlin. I would suggest that turning to Shelley would be an even higher mode of integration. Because what he's turning to is he's not simply turning to the poet, he's turning to the ontological metaphysician and philosopher who is solving for the problem of being, which is dwelling poetically. And a refusal of the separative, isolating alienatory split, division of disciplines, that Shelley's pursuit is everything from science to philosophy to literature, because he is solving for the problem at the level of being, which is the eternal, the structural, the superstructural, from which all else is derived. And these moments in human history themselves are catastrophes of ontological breakdown that the center did not hold in Shelley's time as it collapsed in the 100 years following. Shelley holding a light or a guiding light to the ontos, structurally, I think most clearly in Prometheus Unbound, which metaphysically mirrors my scientific work on the persistence operator. It's a structural match. As with dissipative structures, that what we need to discover is the true infrastructural function of being across scales, and as such, understanding the identity, which we could say of God or of creation or of the universe, of cosmos itself, we are able to derive accurate infrastructural, architectural foundations and solutions at the level of the human being, which is to say civilization, subjective identity, relationship, etc. And I've described these as the derivations, and deriving the human condition from these first principles makes possible a real relationship to being. Once the structural articulation of being is understood as nature, as the gleaming, which is the hidden or veiled intimation of creation itself, which is emerging through all forms, which must be grasped structurally at the root. And of course, this is a highfalutin process of grasping you could say the neural architecture of the cosmos as it is derived and derivable from thermonuclear energy. The chain of the scale of the production of energetic force, which not only guides the solar system, but the cosmos at large in terms of intergalactic relation, which is bodies and beings in space and time. And we return this back down all the way to the level of the bottoming out of the Weimar Republic between the death of Nietzsche's pre-modern atavistic Germany, sun and moon cycles and the myths and narratives therein, and the rise of Hitler's Germany, which is the thermodynamic, thermonuclear transformation of the energetic ground, factory time, electrical time, oil time, which utterly changes the situation or the terrain being negotiated in everyday life, which is Mayakovsky's Biet, which Mayakovsky is attempting to break apart and rend at the root to find the cosmological source of being itself. His poetic pursuit is common to him as it is to Spinoza, although they are at different levels of grasping the ontos. Shelley resides there as well at a very high level. And this problem, this opening or this cavern of the world's midnight, is itself the rupture which reveals the loss or the lack of the true cosmological ontos, as the guiding and binding source of civilization and mankind and universe itself, which must be accurately and adequately grasped at a superstructural level in order to incarnate or bring about real architectural solutions to the problem of being and being in relationship to time. Otherwise, what you have is what Goethe says, a madhouse or an insane asylum of humanity, because humanity is not in relationship to being in any meaningful way, beyond vague intuition and institutional architectures which articulate a narrative or an ideological framework which human beings are hopelessly absorbed and resorbed into as standing ordered resources which then extract from them, such as church and state. So there's what I got. This is critical. It comes down to labor. It comes down to the everyday life. It comes down to the bare and rote physical, existential, and historical conditions of being human, and the failure to understand, know, or acquire or come into deeper communion with the ontos via the revolutions of science and technology is the failure of civilizations and humanity, which extracts the ultimate cost or the ultimate toll, which is chaos, death, calamity, destruction, and terror in the face of the problem of being, which is never solved or resolved, but rather deepened by the collapsing, condensing space and time, which is the acceleration of science and technology. And that this is the ultimate necessary question, not only at the level of being in existence, which is being in relation to oneself and asking the Jobian question, the deepest question, being in relation to nature and God or the universe, cosmos, but the actual possibility of real function, which is to say becoming human in a profoundly cosmological natural sense in relation to the time itself, in relation to history, and in relation to the possibilities of the incarnation, which is the coming into thermodynamic flesh and the possibilities of creation, articulation, and manifestation of the self. So thank you.